See if it falls over.
I think we're on.
I think so too. Good morning. And everybody's probably muted, but at least you can chat to each other. All right. It's 1 minute over. Should we start and get going? The video is being recorded. Can everybody see the screen okay, I hope, that we're sharing? Good. My name is Andreas Hammarskjöld. I'm together here with Michael Niehaus, and we're going to take you through DeployR and what that is. You want to introduce yourself, Michael? I'm sure nobody knows who you are.
Sure. My name is Mike Niehaus. I've been doing this for a while. So, OS deployment. Feels like I made a career out of this.
Seems like it. Yeah. The two of us work for 2Point Software. I'm one of the co-founders of 2Point, also been doing deployments for a very long time. It seems like we made a company out of it. So that's what we're going to talk to you today. We have an extremely busy agenda, but we're going to try to not bore you to death with PowerPoint and focus much more on the demos. But in order for you to understand the demos, there will be some talking around how the infrastructure is set up and what's available and what's to come, etc. After the demos, just to keep everybody hanging on, we will talk about pricing and availability. And hopefully we have a lot of time set aside for a bit of Q&A. I think there is a Q&A section within the Teams application or in the meeting itself. So we'll try to prefer any questions to go in that way rather than in the general chat. With the number of people on the call, the chat could probably get quite busy. So try to use the QA and you can probably type up questions as you go along. I think we have people on the team hopefully standing by to answer some of your questions as they come. Hopefully we'll also answer most of your questions with the presentations and demos that we have as well. So without further ado, let's move into what is DeployR. Obviously, it would be stupid if it wasn't a OS deployment solution, but how is that set together? Well, we built a task sequence engine. With that, there is an element of a user interface, and all of that comes with that. It's also a big portion of what we're trying to do is to build a platform to make things easier to work within the system. So we're not going to cover too much of that today, but you'll have to take with you that, and we have some slides on that as well. Also, a lot of this is work in progress. Everything is not set in stone, so any feedback of what we should do, what we should not do, etc., is really appreciated. So please try to get any feedback over to us. There is, of course, quite a lot of overlap to other 2Point software technology that we have. We would be stupid of us if we were to build a system and then compete with our own technology. So there is a merger of both some of the recover pieces, the StifleR pieces, or same as our iPixie pieces that will go into the DeployR solution. But today's agenda is really about focusing on the core DeployR pieces and not talk so much about the other pieces. It's inevitable to talk about some of it, so we will cover as much as we can. But if you get confused around some of this, join the club. It is a little bit of a confusion to clarify. If you look at the core components, there are some client pieces. That is basically what's executing the task sequence engine. we would be dumb if we didn't copy what we had already learned from MDT and as well as Configuration Manager and the work that we've done over the years. So we try to learn as much from that. So anyone that has worked with the deployment engine in MDT or Configuration Manager will be pretty familiar with the concepts. In the service side, we have both a database that holds all the steps and sequences as well as script data. They are then linked up with web services together with the database for the content storage, as well as user interface pieces. And then we have the blue piece, which is really the community aspect where we see people working and publishing out. The plan is to try to use as much as that existing within the user interface so that you don't have to leave that in order to collaborate, but more on that to come as well. If we look at the communication and protocols, there's no more SMB. Everything is HTTPS based. I'm pretty sure if you really want to, you could run it as unprotected HTTP as well, but we plan that everybody will be using HTTPS for this. We do have, since we are running on HTTP, we have native peering, both together with branch cache and for any content that is coming down from Intune or store apps, etc., will be delivery optimization. So we kind of built that in rather than boxing it in from the behind, from the, sort of after the fact. So from an infrastructure perspective, this is probably what you'll be looking for. We have the iPXE Anywhere piece there to point out that DeployR is not a PXE boot solution. It is taking care of the sequences to deploy the machines. You can get there either by using PXE booted devices or as well as using USB. If we have time permitting later in the session, we'll cover more about our plans for the USB piece. And then you can also see that we have the Stifler server that actually holds the user interface. So currently DeployR is requiring the Stifler server, and we'll take you through some of the pieces of why we built it that way. So when we started to kind of decide what we wanted to build, a lot of the things that we wanted and that people requested both for and had in Configuration Manager as well as MDT, we knew that we've already built a lot of it already. So for instance, when it comes to OSD reporting, we built an enormous amount of work or things around that in our existing Stifler server. Same with tools for troubleshooting. We're currently working on the role-based access for RBAC for all of this, as well as the Autopilot real-time tracking and all of the client peer-to-peer pieces as well. So it would be stupid of us to try to rebuild exactly the same again. So rather than doing that, we sort of shifted a lot of that technology to be available into DeployR. It's a bit of a nightmare from a code perspective to clean a lot of this up, but I think we've done a pretty good job on that. So we're covering the defaults by, out of the box really. We will allow both for zero touch-like installations, so ZTI, having the full automation, as well as having the more traditional light touch pieces as well for you to actually, if you want to have a technician answer 16 questions and then run it, so you can do that. Nothing stops you from also having your own methods around to copy out some of the binaries to trigger off the builds. And we're also investigating in the full push pieces later down the line as well. There will be 3 versions available. There will be an enterprise, which is what we're kind of focusing on up top. It has all the bells and whistles, and there are a lot of moving parts. Then we basically plan to have a pay-as-you-go and community version that is basically free. And instead of focusing on that, there will be more webinars in the year that covers more of those and what exactly is included. So currently the team is focusing on getting all of the things ready, and then we basically can determine. And here's also where your feedback is really asked for, to see how and what you'd like to see and how you what you would like to see in the pay-as-you-go sort of options, as well as the community aspect of it. There is a little bit of a feature comparison list, and as you see, the top 3 are the sort of box standard: the light touch installation, zero touch installation, user-driven installation. But then it gets the water gets a bit muddy. We start talking about peer-to-peer, where that MDT, of course, didn't do that by the use of SMB. With MEMCM, 2-Point Software offered the OSD toolkit to do that in WinP, etc. But then we talk about other things like multi-OS vendor support, ARM64 support, RBAC, the different hybrid USB support that we hope to cover. There are a lot of things that we put into the DeployR piece that isn't available in MDT or in MEMCM. And this is not a complete list. It will be more features added to as we complete them as well. So that takes us into a feature by version table. This is also not really set in stone, but it gives you an indication that what we want to deploy or what we want to give away as the community edition, we need to remove some of the pieces because they're more tied into the enterprise space. But we know that there is a need for something. Same goes with pay-as-you-go. There will be aspect of this where we'll host some of the infrastructure potentially, and that comes at a cost. But how do we basically retain some of those pieces? That takes us to collaboration and online services, which a lot of the things that we saw both in the MEMCM world as well as MDT it was hard to do test things in pre-prod and then move things to prod and then basically sunset some of those changes. So when we designed the overall system, we really wanted to keep that mentality, but rather than later adding the logic for it, we wanted to build the system so that this is easily available from in the system itself. Same goes with anybody that has done work. We try to edit the task sequence that is used in production and then making a mistake and then drastically trying to roll back to whatever version you had before. It has never been so easy either in MDT or in MEMCM. There is also the large aspect that we wanted to get away from. Instead of everybody doing the same work and then posting it on a blog and then people going there and copying down the script and repeating the tasks within their task sequences, i.e. going back to the work in test pre-prod, it would be a lot better if we can build a system to natively support a lot of this. So we wanted also to take not only that, but to take it one step further. So we actually want you to be able to publish your own steps, i.e. design the UI element for it, as well as then publishing your steps that you published out into other sequences that people can actually use. And there's no real limit of what pieces we want to do that's part of that as a community. Driver support, I think everybody deals with. And when we say drivers, there's an element of, hey, this driver works on this Lenovo. Yes, it works until somebody is then trying to put a USB supported dongle that connects to some sort of TV. Then you have to have this specific version, and because it doesn't work in the latest one. And instead of going back to this whole, somebody writes a blog pointing out this thing, and then we want to build it into so that we can natively support this information flowing through the system. So what does that mean for you? Well, it means that if you are a TPM expert, and I think we have somebody else, some of them on the call, they can actually build their own step to set the TPM up. They don't have to have a script that takes 1 billion inputs. They can build the UI themselves and then publish that step out to the community with, of course, version control and all of that. Let's say somebody really liked chocolatey. I can't even spell chocolatey. I can tell, and nobody pointed out that that was spelled wrong. But basically, if you want to do chocolatey apps, they should be able to build their UI to install chocolatey apps as part of the sequence. Let's say somebody really like Winget. They should be able to create a UI element for installing Winget. So there will be, of course, some sort of moderation for this. We don't want 1 billion different steps that does exactly the same thing. But you can think of it as a sort of a community hub that we had in Configuration Manager, but with the ability to actually change the task sequence engine UI element as well of it. Same goes with the user-driven installation piece. Rather than ending up with 16 different versions of the UDI, we want you to be able to build the user-driven installation pieces inside the web UI itself. So you can then use the controls to, hey, I want this drop down and I want it to contain these values and these things inside of it. And then you could publish that sort of element out so that other people in the community can use that. Application sources application is probably where we spent some of the most amount of time. And it's really, we didn't want to build a software definition library, but we needed to have some sort of definition of where the applications are. So we started simple, and this will probably expand out on it so that we hold the resources for the entities that goes in, but not so much of the metadata. So we started small to allow simple command line installation for applications, obviously knowing that there's the whole Winget, Chocolatey, Intune, and third-party apps providers, etc., that probably are interested to integrate with this system as well. And I think with that, I will hand over to Michael to do a bit of talking.
All right, so let's shift focus and talk more about demos. Figured it would be useful to start off with kind of the walkthrough. So cooking show style, we've done pre-recorded videos and edited them to make them go faster. Otherwise, we'd be sitting here staring at progress bars for the next couple of hours. But as we go through this, just realize that the real-time deployments for doing these task sequences generally are in the 10 to 15 minute range for a device. So we're speeding them up just so that we can get through more demos. So we'll start off from the beginning. How do we create and deploy an operating system? We'll start from the administrative side of things, where we are in the DeployR portal. So we have a web console where we can go in and see the task sequences, step definitions, and content items for DeployR. We'll start off by creating a content item for Windows 11 24H2. I just downloaded this month's ISO, extracted the WIM from that, so we'll say that this is an operating system. It is a single file, since we just need the WIM. We'll create a version of that. Everything that we create is versioned so that we can manage what's currently in active use versus what's in development. Upload the actual install.wim, which is a pretty hefty 5 GB file. Store a copy of that with our DeployR web server. And then we can go on to the next step of creating a task sequence. So we'll add a task sequence. I'll call it build in this case. Create a new version of that task sequence, the initial version 1. And then we can go into the task sequence editor. I'll edit that to say this one's active, and then we'll build out the steps, starting with formatting the disk. We don't have any configurable options on that step today, but we'll probably add those in the future. Next, we'll apply the operating system. So we'll choose the image that we just created previously, Windows 11 24H2. We can specify the image index from that image, so I'll choose 3 for enterprise. We don't need an answer file because we'll pre-provide some standard templates that we'll use automatically. We have multiple mechanisms for actually controlling the flow into the OS. If we use setup complete, the task sequence finishes before the user can actually log on to the device, so that's preferred. We'll add a prepare operating system step so that we can do some downloads and tweaks of the OS before we boot into it. Then we'll boot into that new OS. And finally do some OS configuration once we're in that new OS. So that's basically the minimal task sequence that we need to go through. We can save those changes, and now we have a task sequence that's ready to deploy. So the next step, we go to a physical machine and boot it up. We'll start off with Pixie in this case, so we're using iPixie, another 2Pints product for this, to load the DeployR generated Windows PE boot image from the server. That will be loaded using peering so that we can efficiently transfer that not only from the server but also leveraging other clients on the machine. So we're in Windows PE. We'll talk to the server, get a list of the task sequences. I picked the deploy or the build task sequence that I just created, and now it's off and running. So we formatted the disk pretty quickly. Now we're downloading the content. We're peering the content, even though this is brand new content that no one's actually seen before. So that 24H2 image isn't actually on any of the clients. It actually is very similar, though, to previous OS images that are. So it's able to peer most of the content from other machines, but not all of the content. After more of the machines have this latest set of bits, then it's able to do 100% peering, but until then it might not be quite 100. So we've done that. We've done the prepare OS, which downloaded the runtime files that we need to continue this once we get into the OS. We boot into a super sped up specialization process. We install our bootstrap files, resume the task sequence, and we're done. At that point, we were at the end of setup complete. So as soon as I clicked finish to close that, then we can see the desktop and we can then log into the machine. So that's the basic end-to-end support. The next piece, we should probably do something a little bit more useful and add some drivers and apps into that so we can create content items for those, starting with the drivers for my Optiplex Micro 7010. We'll specify that this is a driver pack and it's a folder of content. We can then add a new version. And on that version, we specify the manufacturer and model. So I'll put in Dell and Optiplex Micro 7010 so that we automatically match these driver packs to the manufacturer and model of machines that they're applicable to. We do use the model alias logic that we've carried forward from PSD and other MDT-based solutions so that we can easily use friendly model names and manufacturers. But once we've selected the folder, we then upload all of that content to the server. After it's all been uploaded, all right, we have a driver pack. Next step, we'll add an application. So we'll add Microsoft 365 apps. It is an application. Again, it's a folder of content. So once we have that, we'll add a new version. And in this case, we'll put in the command line that we need to install it. Specify configure. And then we can add content to that. So I'll select the full set of Office install files, which just enables us to peer all of that content. We could just as easily point to the cloud and download the bits from there. But in this case, we'll have a full 3 gig package containing all that content. So now we have an app, we have drivers. Let's go in and edit our task sequence and add steps to take care of those as well. So we'll edit the task sequence. After the apply operating system step, we can add a step to inject drivers. You may have noticed there's also a step there to inject drivers from the cloud. So we could actually go out to the OEM website and download the driver packs directly if you like to take your chances and grab whatever drivers the OEMs might have out there, but it is an option. We can then add a step to install the application that we created. And with that in place, we can save the changes to the task sequence. Now, when we go to a client machine, we can speed our way through the initial phases of this to quickly get to the new stuff. We choose the task sequence, format, download the OS, apply the OS after we're done with that, and then we can download the drivers. While we're waiting, there's a few other things that we can show here. We have the ability to open up the logs as they're being written. So we're writing out log files in the same format as Config Manager. Everyone likes CM Trace. We can't ship a copy of it, but if you have a copy of it, we'll embed it in our generated Windows PE boot images so you can easily launch it. We also have a debugger built in. It's not fully featured yet, but we can click pause to stop the task sequence at the beginning and end of each step and then continue when we're ready to go again. We will expect a more full-featured debugger in the future, but that's something that's still being worked on. Now we're downloading the driver pack, extracting the contents of that, and injecting the drivers into the OS. Once that's done, we'll continue the OS, boot into that new OS, go through the whole specialization process. And once that's done, we should be able to see the installation of Microsoft 365 Office. So we'll download that 3 gig package, run the command line that was specified to install Office. Still got a little bit of work to do to get rid of that command prompt. And then the task sequence is complete. So at that point, again, we're to the desktop. The user can sign in. They can continue on to be productive. So one of the questions asked in the chat is, well, what about Autopilot? In the Autopilot case, the basic job for Autopilot is to configure an operating system that's already on the device. So question is, well, how do you get the operating system onto the device? Either you're going to buy a machine from the OEM with that OS pre-installed, which is great, or you're going to need some sort of bare metal deployment process to load it onto the device in the first place. Even if you're just doing this for break-fix scenarios, maybe you had a hard drive that failed, you've put a new hard drive into the machine, or the machine's not working properly anymore and you want to re-image it and get it back to the beginning of the Autopilot process. Either way, you need a bare metal solution for that. So maybe once you've moved all the way to Intune and you're using Autopilot for all your devices, you don't want to keep Config Manager around for just OSD. Maybe DeployR is a workable solution for that. Obviously, if you're using MDT today and MDT is going out of support, DeployR is to fill in that gap and provide a bare metal solution that you can use. So if we look at a task sequence to get the device ready for Autopilot, the basic steps are not that different from what we had looked at before. If we looked at the task sequence that we had built out in the previous demo, we apply the operating system using setup complete. And once we're in the new OS, the task sequence completes. In this case, we can create a task sequence for Autopilot that's a little bit different in that it still formats the disk, it applies the OS, but then it goes through Ubi normally. So it doesn't use an unattend.xml. And we can even configure this to go directly to Windows Update and download the OS from the cloud just by specifying the OS that we want. We can do the same for drivers. So we can, again, go out and grab the drivers directly from the OEM website, inject those, and as soon as the process is finished, finish the task sequence while we're still in Windows PE, and then reboot into that new OS. So it's a simpler process where you're allowing Autopilot to do the full configuration of the device. You're just using DeployR to configure the machine. So you can see all of the available choices that we have for downloading the operating system, the UI elements that we have that you could use for any custom task sequence steps to do drop-down lists and that sort of thing. So all of that is basically defined in the step definitions themselves. So each of these steps defines its own UI that specifies all the different task sequence variables that need to be configured and set, and what the UI should look like. Is it a number? Is it a string? Is it a drop-down? Is it a checkbox? So all of that's easy to do. So we can do all kinds of weird things, like let's create a toaster step where we put in a drop-down, and the drop-down has options for specifying the number of pieces of toast that you want to toast. Obviously, it's a silly example, but we can do any sort of UI customization needed just by going into the UI and configuring those. So it's those sorts of things that we hope to get more community generation of, so that we can have people generate those and add them into DeployR to be able to then use in task sequences. Once that's available, we could go into a task sequence and immediately use it. So if I go into just a random task sequence and say to edit it, I can add that new toaster step. And when we look at it, there's our drop down with 1 or 2 slices. So it's really that easy to create these additional steps where you attach scripts to them, you attach content to them, and be able to use those within your own custom task sequences. All right, so going back to the Autopilot scenario, if we have a machine where we need an OS on it, we can boot it up using Pixie or USB or whatever. This time when it boots up, we'll choose that to Autopilot task sequence. So we'll download and apply the OS. Should look familiar. In this case, we're getting 100% peering, which is using some other 2-pint magic. We can talk about that more at a later date. We can then download the drivers directly from the OEM and extract them. So HP, Lenovo, Dell, Microsoft, doesn't matter. We can get the necessary driver packs from in whatever format, extract them while we're in Windows PE so that we can then finish the task sequence in Windows PE, now boot into the new OS and start the Ubi process. So where DeployR finishes, Autopilot takes over. Now we're at the start of Ubi. You would go through, sign in with your Enter ID credentials, and go through the rest of the Autopilot process. It's also worth mentioning that one of the continuation options that we have for the task sequence is we can run the task sequence in the specialized phase. So we could actually have a task sequence that deploys the OS, injects the drivers, boots into the new OS, does customization of the new OS, including apps and updates and any other tweaks that you want to perform, and then still go through Ubi and go through the rest of the Autopilot process. So you could then kind of have a slider between what do I want to do via DeployR versus what do I want to do via Intune and Autopilot. So a little bit more flexibility with that as well, which will open up some interesting scenarios for people to try out. ARM64 support. Obviously, we support ARM64 while we're going through all of this trouble. So if we have a Snapdragon-based machine, we can boot it up, including using Pixie, again, using our iPixie server. Choose our ARM64 boot image and go through the same type of task sequence for ARM64 devices. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a very easy thing to do. As we've discovered going through the various ARM64 device types out there, driver management for ARM devices is still a bit of a pain, but once you work through those, at least you can get to a point where it's easy enough to choose a task sequence running ARM64 to format the disk, download the new operating system image, apply that to the machine, inject the drivers provided by the OEMs, and then boot into that new OS. So the net result is that it works just like x64. You just will have to deal with the fun of driver management with ARM64 devices. The newest generation, at least, most of them use the same driver packs, as they're basically a Qualcomm reference design with minor tweaks by the OEM on top of that, but that still does mean it's an interesting experience to go through. We also, since we've been building this on top of .NET 8 and PowerShell 7, which are cross-platform, we thought, well, there's no reason we can't do Linux-based OSs as well. So that is part of the plan, is to support various Linux distributions, but we started off with one that was just a little simpler, which is Chrome OS Flex. So maybe you've got some of these machines out there running Windows 10 that don't support Windows 11, and you don't know what you're going to do with them after Windows 10 goes out of support. Well, maybe you put Chrome OS Flex on them. That's basically the purpose of Chrome OS Flex. So in this case, we'll Pixie boot a machine again, and we'll choose a Linux boot image. That Linux boot image will boot up and lay down the OS Flex image. So DeployR Linux. Once we're into Linux, we see exactly the same UI that we saw in Windows PE, where we can choose a task sequence. Choose the Chrome OS Flex task sequence. We'll start that one out. It will download a zipped version of the disk image. It'll apply that to the disk. Once that's done, it can reboot directly into that new disk image. And now we have a device running Chrome OS Flex. I'll skip the UBI process and just say that I want to browse as guest so that I can very quickly get to the desktop and use Chrome OS. So convenient, very fast. I mean, that whole task sequence, if you did it real time, would take about 5 minutes. So it's super simple. Google does maintain a list of supported hardware for that. Generally, they have a lot of hardware support, but it doesn't go back forever. So don't expect to take a 15-year-old machine out of the drawer and use it with that. But pretty much anything within the last several years, they have drivers built in for that. But check their hardware compatibility list for the details. But we can at least make it easy for mass producing Chrome OS Flex machines as well. All right, Andreas, back to you.
All right, then we can hopefully skip the presentation a bit, but I should have done that. Do I need to share my screen again? I assume so, right? No, you're good? All right. You're on mute, Michael, if you're talking. Should have skipped this. There we go. No, one more. Come on.
You either
All
need
right.
to share your desktop or tell me where you're at so I can advance
No,
the
no, no.
slides.
Yeah. I think I can share. Let me see. No. Oh, it uploaded the deck again, I think. All right. Let me. All right. Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. That takes us to pricing and availability pieces. As we're currently have a few different options that we're working on, I'd like to highlight what we're currently working on would probably be step number 2. So what we're focusing currently is on the red piece, which is DeployR running enterprise and sort of self-hosted. That's the first piece that we hope to have available sort of in Q2 for people to test. And step 2 after that is probably the self-hosted pay-as-you-go options. As you can see, there is also Blue software as a service offerings potentially available. It's more where we see where people want us to focus on. Primarily today, most of the requests are been driven through the enterprise space to self-host. That doesn't mean that it can't be self-hosted in Azure or any sort of data center in the cloud or wherever, but it will still consider what we say self-hosted. SaaS is when we will be hosting the implementation for you. We're aimed to have that available, but when that is still not determined. There is a little bit of a status update as well. There is a lot of these different things, but what we'd like to get across is that we're starting to get to a point where most of the things are ready. Still needs a fair amount of testing, etc., and we're sort of waiting for some of the features to be available before we can move ahead. And if we tend to look at this sort of on a timeline, we will have continue with our internal testing as well as customer testing from our cloud implementation of this. That was set up sometime in end of 2024, and we'll continue through that. And when we reach sort of Q2 is where you will be able to hopefully install DeployR on your own. And then after that, we'll start looking at the pay-as-you-go sort of option. One of the things that we're wanting to do as well is to get this up so that you can deploy it easily in your own Azure using templates and just buy it from the marketplace. And also using, if you do have Azure Mac credits, so that you can actually use that too. And once a lot of these bullet points are sort of sorted, we hope to aim more to see what we can do around the community edition. And we do have some questions in the upcoming slides. But some of the reasons why we're not releasing this to a broad market currently, we are a small company. So if we were to have all of you on the call, which was up to 300 people, downloading this and running into issues, it would be very hard for us to have a good outcome of that. So we're focusing heavily on the automation pieces to help so that you can download and start running this, but that we can easily also upgrade you without having a lot of work or hand holding. We're also a little bit still at the point, even though it's less, where we do changes to the system that breaks upgrades, so you have to start over. And we want to be able to give you a upgradability, but without any data loss. And the initial pieces of that went in a couple of weeks ago around import and export of task sequences, having good templates so that when you're testing this, you don't have to set up everything yourself. So you can more or less install the MSIs and then start deploying in a very fast way and not sort of having to read the 500-page documentation for it. That takes us to the pricing. For the enterprise piece of DeployR, the target price is $575 per year, but that is for all of the bells and whistles, and there will be a lot of different components that might not really apply to the pay-as-you-go. So we are aware that people would probably also want a lower price point with less features and less bells and whistles. And we hope to have that communicated to the market around Q2, Q3 timeframe. Probably pay-as-you-go will be the first one, and we will learn a lot what people like to use in the DeployR enterprise, and then of course try to streamline that down to a more firm model. Basically, if we then look at what's next, I'm going to try to have as much possible that we can open up for the Q&A. We just created a DeployR Reddit subthread, so if we did not answer your questions, and we'll spend some time answering the questions in the Q&A as well. But if you didn't get your answer, go there and try to ask the question, and we'll follow up. There'll also be at the end of Q1, so probably in about 6 or 7 weeks, there will be another webinar of this where we'll showcase more of the pieces that we've done, hopefully with a lot more of around the tracking. There were some people requesting support to be able to remote troubleshoot the devices, etc. So hopefully we can cover a lot of that then as well. Also, April, May are busy months for us. We have the MEM conference in Paris, as well as the MMS MOA in Minnesota. We're hoping to show a lot of this and the capabilities around the system. Probably sometime after that, there will be a release webinar, probably before Northern Europe breaks for summer vacation, so that you have something to play with over the summer when the rain keeps falling down. But keep an eye out on X, as well as all of the other channels of communication. We will also post a lot of the webinars and updates on our website, as well as on the Reddit pages. And I think that takes us into the generic Q&A. And in case nobody has questions for us, which there are quite a lot of questions in the Q&A and also in the chat, and we'll try to answer as much of them as we can. We have some questions for you. One question is whether complete offline media is required. And when I say online media, we can pretty much get to a stage where 99.9% of the content that's pulled down will be cached on either USB or other types of sources, but it's still a live deployment. But you can do it over a very poor connection. But do we still have scenarios where a device cannot talk to anything, i.e. no network cable, where you like this to actually work? Also, we have questions around what pricing you would like to see on a pay-as-you-go. Is it pay-per-admin, pay-per-build, pay-per-usage, i.e., we divvy up the cost for the infrastructure and the license and everybody shares, so the more people we get on it, the cheaper. Lots of different versions. Same with the free version. Can that be a SaaS only? That help us tremendously for not having to support a large volume of people downloading. We can probably have a better infrastructure available, but is that good enough? Also, is there an interest to have paid support for this future free version, i.e. you use the community version and you buy support for it? So if you'd like to answer in the chat or in the QA, that doesn't really matter. And with that, I think we can open up the Q&A if people have questions. Is it possible to, can we get people to talk? That is the question. Are we too many people?
I think you can unmute only one and one.
I
think we can unmute everyone at once.
But it seems like some of in the chat, I can see that community complete offline is required. So that is good information for us to know. We have a pretty good understanding. We built it to be able to support it. There are, of course, problems with some of the USB logic. Like we have two elements of it that we're looking of course, the meat building over network as well as USB is what we want to support. The problem is really what we want to put on the USB. There are some issues with the USB. One of the biggest one, like apart from the security aspect, is that data gets outdated on the USB key fast. So if we can have an ability to update it automatically, that would be probably useful. So in case of our engineering effort, will probably focus on the 1 and 2. And USB hybrid is where the USB is initiated from it, but everything is cached on the USB drive. And then secondly, the third is the full USB media. And the problem is not so much for us, the problem will be for you guys, because you're going to have to keep it updated. And sort of the goal for the USB hybrid media is that 99% of the content comes from the USB key itself. It is encrypted and it will be sort of self-updating, and also with tamper protection. So even if you leave your USB stick on the bus, somebody finds it, they won't be able to actually do anything with it, which is quite a bit of a doing that on a complete standalone USB toolkit is slightly harder. Then we need to encrypt it, but the password can't be on the media. So if you forget the password, it's gone forever. But
There's some additional pricing and licensing questions in the Q&A. First was, does the price listed include iPixie?
So the pricing of iPixie is not included in that. And it goes back a little bit to the question, like we have some customers that want to use it for very different things. So we didn't want to include it. That doesn't mean that you can get a very good pricing by using some of the 2-point bundles to get the Pixie pieces as well.
Another one asking about product support and SLAs for the paid option. What kind of options are there?
In terms of for the system, like for high availability and those scenarios?
I think the question is more like, what's our standard SLA for support?
Okay, so I think that the terms and conditions should be on our website. If they're not, give us a ping. It should be under support on the website.
Another one in the same category is the per client price calculated on the total clients in the organization or clients where the software is expected to be used.
That's always we try to make our software so it's so useful that you want to use it everywhere. But of course, it's a discussion point at implementation. There could be cases where, yeah, it's solely going to be used in this classroom, etc., but not anywhere else. And so we're pretty flexible on a lot of that.
Question around
I see a
this.
question for the public sector pricing, which I don't think we've actually included, so we'll have to go back on that one.
It's a technical question on the specialized phase. If you use that, are there any limitations as far as what can be run or installed? There aren't any that I've run into yet. So I've installed MSIs and standard installers and run scripts and that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean there isn't something that will break or won't work properly when run via specialized. The subsequent question around Win32 apps from Intune. Currently, we don't have a way of running Intune Win32 apps directly. Certainly, you could add the equivalent Win32 app into DeployR and use that during a specialized task sequence, Intune would come along later and be able to see that, oh, hey, this app's already installed by looking at the detection rules and skip the installation once the device is Intune enrolled. Question was, will the build interface be brandable with company logos and backgrounds? For the background, it's pretty easy. It's a file included in a folder that gets embedded into the Windows PE boot image, so that's easy to replace. Branding beyond that, like if you wanted to change icons or text on the UI, we don't have any options for that today, but certainly that's something that we can look at. Question about language related settings. We haven't done anything related to languages yet. Obviously, that would be something of interest to a lot of people, so it is something that we'll look at. At this point, we've been focused more on the engine and trying to get the runtime environment up and running. The fleshing out of the task sequence and the different steps is something that comes later. We've also been looking at the potential of running PSD on top of DeployR. So PSD, if you aren't familiar with it, is a open source PowerShell based set of scripts that run on top of MDT today. But if MDT goes out of support and PSD doesn't run on top of MDT anymore, well, we want to be able to rehost it on top of DeployR. That's not necessarily a trivial exercise because of the implementation differences between MDT and DeployR, but at least from an engine perspective, it is a compatible engine to be able to run task sequences like that with task sequence variables and the like. So we think that we can make that work as well. There's one that says on the task sequence list where I'm choosing the task sequence, can you make a preferred list so the users don't always take the first on the list? We don't have that option today. You can hard code the value, so you could skip the question altogether and say always run this task sequence. But being able to specify a default, today it's going to display them in alphabetical order and show the one at the top of the list. So it's something that we could consider as like a default, but not something that's in the wizard today.
So we got a question about the options to see the different task sequence statuses, success and failure. And that's something that wasn't in the demo that we hope to demo next week. So within the Stiper piece, you will be able to see more or less in real time exactly what you see on the screen, and then being able to get also statistics for that for historic purposes, as well as actually, which is one of the big things that we wanted to do. Let's say you manage to push out a DeployR sequence to 5,000 devices, and the first one that you started first, right? You see that that fails on one of the steps because you made a typo. So we want to have the ability for you to pause all of those 5,000 machines or the 4,999 machines, correct the step, and then get that step in the sequence updated on the machines that are already running. And this is very easy to do in sort of in theory in the code. We planned for it, but it's a little bit more complicated in the practical sense of how to do it. But it's definitely something that we're aiming to do.
It's a question of whether we had iGel support, something we could consider. Basically, I said, email me and we can talk more about that one. I mean, there's no reason we can't support deployment, bare metal deployment of any OS, but obviously our priorities are Windows first and then other things to consider after that. Question about how resilient DeployR is for temporary network drops between the client and the server. Will the installation resume? It's not something that we've done a lot of testing on yet. In theory, yes. In practice, we haven't actually tried it.
Yeah, but as we've worked with bits that does the same thing, so in the OSD toolkit today, for instance, you can unplug the network card and the whole deployment sequence will stop and wait for you to replug it. So we'll probably want to do the same thing where X number of retries for X number of times for us to detect that network is back again.
Question around using OSD for Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows 11 multi-user enterprise virtual machines. Will the product support that scenario? I mean, can we run a task sequence in Windows 11 multi-user enterprise virtual machine? Yes. Can we build a Windows 11 multi-user enterprise image? Build and capture is one of those things that we want to add. Can we deploy a Windows 11 multi-user enterprise virtual machine to Azure? No, that would be Azure's job. You take the resulting image and upload the VHD. So in that particular case, like if you're building VDI base images, we just want to be able to sysprep and shut down. So you could then take the resulting VHD from the VM and use that as your base. So certainly a scenario like that should be doable.
There's some questions around if we can deploy over Wi-Fi. And the Wi-Fi, once we're in WinPE, is the easy part. The question is how we get to it. There are two answers to that. Either you have to use some sort of media, or you have to PXE boot over Wi-Fi. And there are more and more OEMs that supports the PXE boot over Wi-Fi, or basically pointing out a boot file to start from. So that's something that we cover a lot in our Recover solution. That doesn't mean that you can't follow some of our guides for that, and then you have DeployR to kick that off. Obviously, it depends a little bit on where and how those users are located. If they're located at home and you want to build over the internet, there is a security element that the Recover pieces holds, which you will have to build yourself in order to hand over to DeployR. So I think we're at the hour. Thank you so much for everybody for joining. We'll try to stay a little bit to answer some of the questions, but hopefully we'll see you again in a couple of weeks when we have the follow-up. And we'll show some more of the pieces that we've built as well. Thank you.